Evan, 28, returned to his hometown after nearly a decade away when he received a call from the local city office informing him that an old storage facility under Maple Street, an area he had never even thought about since childhood, was being cleared out and that his name had appeared in some of the records tied to it. At first, he assumed it was a mistake. He hadn't lived there since he was a teenager, and he certainly didn't own anything in storage anywhere in town. But the letter was official enough that curiosity outweighed confusion, and a week later he found himself driving back into the same quiet streets he had once been desperate to leave. The town hadn't changed much. The same small shops, the same worn sidewalks, the same slow rhythm of life that made everything feel slightly paused in time. When he arrived at the municipal building, a clerk handed him a simple key and a folder marked with his full name, even though he didn't recognize the handwriting. Inside the folder was a list of items supposedly registered under his identity, items he had no memory of ever owning or storing. The clerk didn't seem particularly surprised when Evan asked about it. In fact, she acted like she had been expecting him to come in. She explained that the storage facility under Maple Street wasn't a typical rental space. It was old, dating back decades, and most of its records were incomplete. Some units had been reassigned, some abandoned, and some simply kept active even when no one checked them for years. Evan asked for clarification on why his name was attached at all, and the clerk simply slid a second document across the counter. It was a dated log entry from almost 15 years earlier, signed with what looked like his father's handwriting. That alone was enough to make Evan pause. His father had passed away years ago, and he had never mentioned anything about storage units or facilities beneath Maple Street. The clerk pointed to a unit number written at the top of the page and told him it was still active. No one had accessed it in over a decade, but technically it still belonged to him. That evening, Evan stood outside the entrance to the underground facility. It was located behind an unmarked maintenance door between two buildings downtown, something most people would walk past without noticing. The air felt different near it, cooler, quieter, almost like the sound of the street didn't fully reach the space around it. When he unlocked the door and stepped inside, he expected dust, darkness, maybe even emptiness. Instead, he found a narrow hallway with fluorescent lights already turned on, humming softly as if they had been waiting for him. The hallway led downward, deeper than he expected, until he reached a series of numbered doors. Each one was labeled in a clean, consistent font, but the strange part was how new everything looked despite how old the facility was supposed to be. When Evan finally reached his assigned unit, he hesitated for a moment before opening it. The lock turned easily, almost too easily, and the door swung open without resistance. Inside was not clutter or forgotten storage, but a carefully arranged space. Boxes lined the walls, each labeled in neat handwriting. A small desk sat in the center of the room with a single chair. On top of the desk was a notebook with his name written on it again, the same unfamiliar handwriting as the folder upstairs. Evan stepped inside slowly, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Nothing about this place felt abandoned. It felt maintained, intentionally preserved, like someone had been keeping it ready for a moment they expected would eventually come. Evan stood inside the storage unit for a long time without moving, reading the sentence on the notebook over and over as if repetition might eventually turn it into something that made sense. "You're later than expected, but that's all right. Everything is still here." The handwriting was steady, deliberate, and unfamiliar, yet something about it felt uncomfortably intentional, like it was meant specifically for him and no one else. The room itself remained unchanged as he looked around again. The boxes along the walls were labeled in categories he didn't immediately understand, things like early decisions, unmade choices, and confirmed paths. One box near the desk simply read, "Before you left." Evan slowly approached it and hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside were everyday objects that didn't seem valuable or important at first glance. A cheap wristwatch he didn't recognize, a set of keys with no markings, and a folded piece of paper with a schedule written on it that listed days from years ago in his life, some of which he clearly remembered and others he had completely forgot. The strange part was how accurate the familiar dates were, as if someone had documented his life more carefully than he ever had. He sat down in the chair without thinking, almost as if the room itself made the decision for him. The notebook on the desk remained open to the same page, but when he flipped it back one page, there was more writing, notes describing events in his life that he distinctly remembered, but with details he had never noticed before. One entry described his move to the city years ago, including the exact time he had left his house, the weather that morning, and even a conversation he had completely forgotten having with his mother before leaving. Evan frowned, trying to rationalize it as some kind of psychological trick or fabricated record, but the specificity made that harder to believe. The further he read, the more it felt like someone had been observing his life in a way that was too consistent to be coincidence. And yet the most unsettling part wasn't the accuracy, it was the tone. The writing wasn't distant or scientific. It was familiar, almost personal. Evan spent nearly an hour going through the contents of the room, slowly opening boxes and reading fragments of information that seemed to map out years of his life in ways he couldn't fully process. Some boxes contained photographs he didn't remember being taken, but in each one he was present at moments he could vaguely recall: school events, quiet afternoons, and places he hadn't thought about in years. In one photo, he was sitting on the front steps of his childhood home, but behind him stood a version of the house he didn't recognize, slightly different in structure, as if it existed in an alternate version of reality. The more he looked, the more inconsistencies appeared, not in the people or events themselves, but in the environment around them. Eventually, he found a second notebook tucked beneath the desk. This one was thinner, older, and more worn. Unlike the first, it didn't feel maintained. On the cover, instead of his name written cleanly, it looked like it had been written multiple times, each attempt slightly different, as if someone had corrected it repeatedly. Inside, the handwriting was more chaotic. Entries were shorter, less structured, and occasionally crossed out mid-sentence. One line stood out immediately: "If he is reading this, then the system is already adjusting." Evan paused at that sentence, rereading it several times. It didn't feel like a metaphor. It felt like a warning that expected to be understood by someone who wasn't him at the time of writing. Before he could continue, the hallway lights outside the unit flickered once, dimming briefly before returning to normal. Evan froze, listening carefully, but the silence remained undisturbed. Still, something about the environment felt subtly different, as if the space had reacted to his presence. He closed the notebook slowly and placed it back exactly where he found it, unsure whether he was supposed to keep reading or stop entirely. That uncertainty lingered as he sat back in the chair again, noticing for the first time a small speaker embedded in the corner of the ceiling. It hadn't been obvious before. In fact, he was certain it hadn't been visible when he first entered. A faint sound crackled through it a moment later, barely audible at first, then gradually clearer. A calm voice spoke his name. The voice was steady and neutral, almost like a recorded announcement, but the way it said his name made Evan's attention lock instantly. It didn't repeat itself or ask for confirmation. It simply continued speaking as if he had already been expected to listen. It said the archive was not a storage facility in the traditional sense, but a structured record system designed to preserve unresolved timelines, though it did not elaborate on what that meant. Evan sat still, trying to interpret the explanation, but the more the voice spoke, the less it sounded like information and the more it sounded like familiarity being gradually reintroduced. It explained that individuals linked to the archive were not selected randomly, but through long-term continuity markers, patterns in decisions, locations, and inherited behavioral traces that suggested a repeatable life path. Evan finally interrupted out loud, asking who was speaking, but the system did not respond directly to the question. Instead, it continued explaining that his presence in the facility was not an arrival, but a return. That word made him pause. Return. He asked again, louder this time, what that meant, and the speaker responded with a simple clarification. Evan had accessed the archive before, though not in a way he could currently remember. The system did not explain further, only stating that memory continuity had been partially reset during his last departure. At that moment, the lights in the unit dimmed slightly again, and one of the boxes along the wall shifted just enough for Evan to notice. He hadn't touched it, but it was no longer positioned exactly where it had been before. The speaker then said something that stayed with him longer than anything else. It said the archive doesn't show him new information. It restores what his life had already passed through but failed to retain. Evan stood up slowly, suddenly aware that nothing in the room felt static anymore. The notebook on the desk had turned itself back to the first page. The chair he had been sitting in now faced the opposite direction, and the hallway outside, visible through the slightly open door, no longer looked exactly the same as it did when he arrived. The lighting pattern had changed. The hum of the facility was lower, more distant, as if the building itself had entered a different state. Evan walked toward the doorway, hesitating for the first time since arriving, unsure whether stepping further into the facility meant continuing forward or continuing something he had already started long before. Evan hesitated at the doorway longer than he expected to. The hallway outside the unit looked the same at first glance, but now that he was paying closer attention, small inconsistencies stood out in ways he couldn't ignore. The fluorescent lights hummed at a slightly different rhythm than before, almost like they were out of sync with the rest of the building. The carpet pattern along the floor seemed subtly altered too, as if sections had been replaced or reprinted. He looked back into the storage unit and noticed the chair he had been sitting in was now positioned directly facing the desk again, even though he was certain he had left it turned sideways. Nothing about it felt dramatic or violent. It was all quiet, subtle adjustment, like the space itself was correcting something. He stepped into the hallway and immediately felt a shift in atmosphere. The air was cooler now, but not uncomfortable, more like entering a space that was less occupied. The speaker system didn't follow him outside the room, yet he still had the sense that something was aware of his movement. As he walked down the corridor, he noticed more doors than he remembered seeing before. The numbering system had changed slightly. What should have been sequential now seemed inconsistent, skipping numbers or repeating them in ways that didn't make logical sense. Evan stopped at one door and placed his hand on it, but it was warm, not from heat, but from recent contact, as if someone had just been standing on the other side moments ago. He tried to remind himself that this was still a municipal facility under the city. There had to be records, explanations, maintenance logs, something normal. But the deeper he went, the harder it became to reconcile the structure with anything ordinary. Eventually, he returned to the main entrance level, expecting to find the same clerk from earlier. Instead, the front desk was empty. The chair was pushed in neatly, and the computer screen still displayed a login page, but no one was there. The building felt quieter now, almost deliberately so. Evan checked his phone instinctively, but there was no signal, which felt unusual given he had service only moments ago upstairs. That's when he noticed a printed sign on the wall near the exit door that he hadn't seen before. It simply read, "Archive access is temporary. Please return before closure cycle." Evan stood there for a moment, reading the sign repeatedly as if it might change its meaning. Closure cycle wasn't a phrase he recognized in any official context, and yet it sounded structured enough to be intentional. He pushed the exit door open, expecting to step back into the familiar street outside the municipal building, but instead found himself at the entrance to the storage facility again. Not inside, but at the beginning of it. The same dim hallway, the same downward slope, the same fluorescent lighting. He turned back quickly, but the door behind him no longer led outside, it simply led back into the corridor. A slow sense of disorientation began to settle in, not panic, but confusion that didn't escalate, it just expanded. He walked forward again, retracing his steps, and noticed something strange. The unit numbers were now different. The one he had originally entered was no longer labeled with his name. Instead, it had a blank tag as if it was waiting to be assigned again. He checked nearby doors and saw similar inconsistencies, some now labeled with names he vaguely recognized from his childhood, others completely empty, as if awaiting future assignment. Eventually, he found a small control panel embedded in the wall, something he hadn't noticed before. It displayed simple options: access, review, and return. Beneath it was a faint instruction line that read, "All entries must be acknowledged before exit." Evan didn't understand what that meant, but the wording made him pause. It didn't say he was trapped. It implied procedure, like leaving required completion rather than permission. He selected review without fully knowing why, and immediately the screen changed to a list of entries. At the top was his name. Below it were dozens of timestamps spanning years, most of which aligned with moments in his life he remembered, but now each one had attached notes he had never seen before. As Evan began reading through the entries, a pattern started to emerge that made him increasingly uneasy. Each record described moments in his life, but not from his perspective. They were written as observations rather than memories. Things like subject hesitated before decision point, or subject deviated briefly but returned to expected path. It wasn't describing emotions or events in a human way. It was describing behavior like data. Still, what unsettled him most wasn't the language, but the accuracy. Every entry matched something real he could recall, even if faintly. It felt like someone had been documenting his life continuously, but from a distance that removed emotion from it entirely. One entry caught his attention more than the others. It was dated 6 years earlier, shortly before he left his hometown. It read, "Final deviation event observed. Subject prepared for transition into external environment. Archive synchronization will pause until return condition is met." Evan stared at that line for a long time. Return condition? Again, the same idea kept appearing. He had left this place before, apparently, but under conditions that required him to come back later without knowing it. That thought alone made everything feel less like discovery and more like continuation of something already in motion. As he stepped away from the panel, the hallway lights flickered softly again. This time it didn't feel like malfunction, it felt like acknowledgement. He turned toward the direction of his original unit and found himself walking back without consciously deciding to. The door was still open when he arrived, and inside, the notebook on the desk had changed again. New pages were visible, even though he hadn't touched it. One line was freshly written: "You are remembering faster than expected." Evan sat down again, this time without hesitation, because the situation had shifted from curiosity to necessity. Something about the system wasn't just recording him, it was responding to him in real time. The idea that memory itself might be partially structured, or at least organized externally, was difficult to accept, but the evidence in front of him wasn't changing. He flipped through the notebook carefully and noticed that earlier entries now contained slight additions in the margins, as if they had been updated while he was reading them. The handwriting remained the same, but the timing of the changes was impossible to ignore. Then, without warning, the speaker in the ceiling activated again. The same calm voice returned, but this time it sounded slightly closer, less like a recording and more like a presence continuing a conversation. It stated that Evan's current session within the archive was nearing completion, but completion did not mean ending, it meant integration. He asked what integration meant out loud, and this time the system responded more directly. It explained that individuals who enter the archive do not leave as they arrived. Instead, they leave with restored continuity, meaning gaps in memory, understanding, or awareness are restructured into a consistent narrative. Evan listened carefully, realizing the implication was that his perception of his own life might not be fully intact outside this space either. The voice then said something that made him pause completely. It said, "You are not being introduced to something new, you are being returned to the version of yourself that chose this before." Evan stood up slowly, feeling the weight of that sentence settle in. Before he could respond, the lights dimmed briefly and the notebook snapped shut on its own. The chair rotated slightly again, and the hallway outside the door grew noticeably brighter, as if signaling a transition rather than an exit. Evan looked toward it, understanding now that whatever came next wasn't about exploration anymore. It was about deciding whether he was ready to continue something he had already agreed to in the past, even if he couldn't remember doing so. As he stepped out, the corridor didn't change, but his perception of it did. The numbered doors no longer felt random or inconsistent. They now seemed arranged in a pattern he hadn't noticed before, almost like a sequence he was supposed to recognize. He walked slowly, passing doors labeled with unfamiliar names again, but now each one gave him a faint sense of recognition he couldn't fully place. Not memory exactly, but familiarity without detail. Eventually, he reached a junction where the hallway split into two directions. One path led deeper into the facility, dimmer and quieter. The other led upward, toward what he assumed was the exit. He stopped there, realizing that for the first time since arriving, the system wasn't directing him, it was waiting. Evan chose the upward path, moving slowly at first, expecting resistance or another shift in structure, but the hallway remained stable as he walked. The air became slightly warmer the higher he went, and the lighting transitioned from sterile fluorescent tones to something softer, closer to natural daylight. It was subtle, but noticeable enough to feel intentional. Along the way, he began noticing small framed plaques on the walls, something he hadn't seen in the lower levels. Each plaque contained brief descriptions of individuals and dates, but none of them felt like typical records. Instead, they read like summaries of completed phases or transitions, describing people not by their roles, but by changes in their lives. One plaque in particular caught his attention. It had his name on it. Evan stopped immediately and read it carefully. The text described a successful external integration dated several years ago. Beneath it was a short note: subject exhibits stable continuation outside archive environment. Return potential remains active. Evan felt a quiet confusion settle in again, but this time it wasn't overwhelming, it was more reflective. The idea that he had been here before was becoming less like a mystery and more like a repeated condition he was slowly remembering through fragments. He continued upward until he reached a heavy metal door marked simply with a circular symbol instead of text. It was the first time he had seen a symbol like that anywhere in the facility. The door opened without a key. On the other side was not an exit to the street, but a large observation room overlooking multiple levels of the archive below. From this vantage point, Evan could see the structure in a way he couldn't before. It wasn't just hallways and storage units. It was layered, organized vertically and horizontally like a complex system designed for tracking movement across time rather than space. In the lower levels, faint movement could be seen, but not people walking in a normal sense. It looked more like transitions, figures appearing briefly in one place, then another, as if their presence was being repositioned rather than physically traveling. At the center of the observation room stood a single terminal with a live display. As Evan approached it, the screen activated automatically, showing his name again along with a timeline that stretched far longer than his known life. Sections of it were labeled clearly: early formation, initial departure, external cycle, and now return phase. The timeline didn't feel metaphorical, it felt structured, like a schedule rather than a biography. A message appeared on the screen beneath it. You are currently completing a looped continuity sequence. Awareness has reached acceptable threshold for reintegration. Evan read it slowly, realizing that the system wasn't trying to trap him or hide anything. It was trying to finalize something. Evan finally spoke out loud, not to ask a question, but to test whether the system would respond differently now. He said he didn't understand what reintegration meant in practical terms. The system paused for a moment before responding, and when it did, its tone shifted slightly, not more emotional, but more direct. It explained that individuals connected to the archive were part of a continuity model designed to preserve identity consistency across long periods of life progression. Over time, memory naturally degrades, fragments, and becomes inconsistent. The archive exists to restore coherence by reintroducing structured memory layers when individuals reach specific points in their cycle. Evan stood still as he processed that. It wasn't saying he was chosen. It was saying he was being corrected, not fixed in a dramatic sense, but aligned. The system continued, explaining that his earlier visit to the archive had occurred years ago, but upon leaving, his memory of the experience had been intentionally reduced to allow natural external living. That cycle was now complete, and he had returned not by accident, but by progression. Evan looked back at the timeline on the screen, and for the first time, he noticed something he hadn't before. The return phase wasn't marked as beginning, it was marked as resuming. The realization didn't feel like shock anymore. It felt like recognition slowly returning to its original shape. Behind him, the observation room door remained open, and beyond it, the archive below continued its quiet, structured movement. Evan didn't move immediately. Instead, he simply stood there, understanding that whatever decision came next wasn't about escaping or staying. It was about whether he wanted to continue as he was, or as the system remembered him being. Evan stayed in front of the terminal longer than he expected to. The words on the screen didn't change anymore, but they didn't need to. Everything felt like it had already been said in the clearest way the system could manage. Return phase, resuming. Those two words kept repeating in his mind, not as confusion, but as something almost familiar trying to resurface. He slowly reached out and placed his hand on the edge of the console, expecting some kind of reaction, but nothing happened. Instead, the display simply refreshed, showing a smaller section of his timeline expanding outward, as if zooming into a specific moment in his life. The system then added a new line beneath everything else: awareness stabilization required before final integration. Evan read it carefully, then realized something subtle but important. The system wasn't pushing him forward anymore. It was waiting for him to become steady enough to continue. That realization shifted something in his thinking. Up until now, he had been reacting to everything as if it was happening to him without control. But now it felt more like participation, as if the system and his understanding of it had to align before anything could proceed. He turned away from the terminal and looked out across the observation room again, noticing details he hadn't fully processed before. Small lights moving in coordinated patterns, doors opening and closing in time sequences, and faint silhouettes that seemed less like people and more like stages of presence shifting between levels. Evan finally decided to move again, walking along the edge of the observation room where a narrow staircase led upward to another level he hadn't seen yet. As he climbed, the atmosphere changed once more. The hum of the facility grew quieter, replaced by a low ambient tone that felt less mechanical and more natural, like distant wind filtered through walls. At the top of the stairs, he found a smaller room with large glass panels overlooking different sections of the archive. This level felt less operational and more reflective, almost like a monitoring space rather than an active one. Inside, there were chairs positioned in front of the glass, all empty, all facing outward. On one of the desks sat a single document folder already open, as if someone had left it mid-review. Evan approached it slowly and saw that it contained a simplified version of everything he had seen so far: summaries of cycles, behavioral notes, and what looked like guidelines for interaction with the archive system. But what stood out most was a section labeled User Continuity Summary. It listed him not as a visitor, not as a subject, but as a returning participant. Beneath that, it noted, primary external identity remains intact. Internal archive alignment required at scheduled intervals. He sat down in one of the chairs without realizing it, staring out through the glass. From this vantage point, the archive didn't feel like a place he had accidentally entered. It felt like a structure designed with long-term familiarity in mind. Something built not to trap, but to reconnect. And that distinction began to change how he felt about everything he had experienced so far. For the first time since arriving, Evan allowed himself to stop trying to force explanations. Instead, he focused on what he could actually observe without interpretation. The movements in the lower levels weren't chaotic, they were cyclical. Patterns repeated at intervals that suggested coordination rather than randomness. Doors didn't just open and close, they did so in sequences that matched timing patterns across different sections. Even the lighting shifts seemed to follow structured phases rather than malfunction or inconsistency. The more he observed, the more the archive resembled a system designed to maintain continuity rather than disrupt it. The calm voice returned again, but this time it didn't feel like it came from a speaker. It felt more like it came from the space itself. It acknowledged his observation without prompting, stating that recognition of structure is the final stage before reintegration awareness stabilizes fully. Evan asked quietly what would happen after that stage, and for the first time, the system gave a simple, direct answer without layered phrasing. It said, You will continue your external life with restored consistency. Gaps in memory will no longer fragment identity alignment. That explanation should have sounded unsettling, but instead it felt strangely grounding. Like something that had always been slightly off in his understanding was finally being corrected. Evan leaned back in the chair, looking out over the archive again. It wasn't a prison. It wasn't even a mystery anymore. It was starting to feel like maintenance, ongoing adjustment of something that had been left slightly out of sync. Evan eventually stood again and returned to the staircase, descending slowly back toward the lower levels. This time, nothing about the environment felt unfamiliar or shifting. Everything remained stable, as if the system had stopped adjusting itself in response to him and instead matched his understanding directly. When he reached the original hallway, he noticed something different. The doors no longer felt like separate units. They felt like connected points in a single continuous structure, each one representing a stage rather than a location. He returned to his original storage unit, and when he opened the door, the notebook on the desk was already open to a new page. This page was different from the others. Instead of fragmented notes or observational entries, it contained a single, complete paragraph. It read, "External continuity has been successfully restored in prior cycle. Internal return is voluntary but recommended to maintain alignment stability across long-term identity progression." Evan read it slowly, then sat down in the chair again, not out of confusion this time, but out of understanding that whatever this system was, it had never been forcing him. It had been maintaining him. And for the first time, Evan stopped asking where he was supposed to go next, and started wondering how many times he had already been here without realizing it. Evan sat quietly in the storage unit for a long time after reading the final page in the notebook, not because he was stuck, but because nothing in him felt the need to rush anymore. The questions that had been building since he arrived were still there, but they no longer carried the same urgency. Instead, they felt organized now, like pieces that had already been placed into position, even if he had only just become aware of them. The room itself felt different too, not physically changed, but settled, as if it had completed its purpose in showing him what it needed to show. The chair, the desk, the boxes along the wall, they all felt like they belonged to a system that had already accounted for his presence long before he stepped inside. The speaker in the ceiling didn't activate this time. No new explanations came. No adjustments, no updates. It was quiet in a way that felt intentional rather than empty. Evan stood up and walked slowly around the room, not searching for answers anymore, but simply acknowledging what was there. Each box now felt less like a mystery and more like a record of something continuous. Not hidden, just stored. He stopped in front of the box labeled "Before you left" again, but this time he didn't open it. He already understood that whatever was inside, it wasn't meant to change what he knew. It was meant to confirm it when the timing was right. Evan left the storage unit and walked through the hallway without hesitation. The numbered doors no longer felt inconsistent or strange. They felt sequential in a way that suggested he was simply moving through a structure he had already passed through before. The lighting stayed steady, the hum of the facility consistent, and for the first time since arriving, nothing shifted in response to him. It was almost peaceful. When he reached the main entrance level, the clerk was once again behind the desk, typing calmly as if she had never left. She looked up at him briefly, then slid a small document across the counter without speaking. On it was a simple confirmation form. It contained his name, a timestamp, and a line that read, "Cycle acknowledgement confirmed." Beneath it was a space for a signature. Evan stared at it for a moment, then realized something subtle but important. This wasn't a request, it was a record of completion. The clerk didn't rush him. She simply waited, as if this moment had already been accounted for in whatever structure the archive followed. After a long pause, Evan took the pen and signed his name. Not because he fully understood everything, but because refusing no longer felt like the point. When he handed it back, the clerk nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and placed the document into a folder labeled with dozens of other entries identical in format but different in names. After signing, Evan stepped outside the facility expecting a noticeable change, but the world remained exactly as it had been before. The city street was quiet, normal, unchanged. People walked past him without noticing anything unusual. Cars moved through intersections. Life continued without interruption. For a moment, he stood still, trying to reconcile the contrast between what he had just experienced and what he was now seeing. The archive felt vast, structured, and deeply complex, yet the world outside it remained completely ordinary. He began walking without a clear destination, letting his steps guide him rather than choosing a direction. As he moved through familiar streets, something subtle began to settle in his thoughts. Memories that had felt fragmented before now felt smoother, more continuous. Not new memories, just clearer ones. He could recall details of his life with less effort, as if something that had been slightly out of focus had finally sharpened. The feeling wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. It was quiet, like a mental adjustment finishing itself in the background. By the time he reached a familiar corner near his old childhood route, he stopped again, realizing that for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like anything about his life was missing. Evan eventually returned to his apartment later that evening. Everything inside looked exactly as it should. The same furniture, the same lighting, the same quiet atmosphere he was used to. He placed his keys on the counter and stood there for a moment, not thinking about the archive or the facility or the system in any active way. Instead, he simply observed how normal everything felt now. It wasn't that the experience had faded, it was that it had settled into place like a completed layer beneath everything else. As he moved through his routine, making a simple meal and turning on a low background sound for the evening, he noticed something small but meaningful. His thoughts no longer jumped or fragmented the way they used to when he was tired or overwhelmed. There was a continuity to them now, a sense that everything followed smoothly from one idea to the next without gaps. He didn't question it, it simply felt natural. Before going to bed, he glanced once toward his hallway mirror and paused briefly. For a moment, he couldn't tell if anything about him had changed or if it was just perception, but then he realized it didn't matter. The version of himself he was seeing now felt consistent in a way that didn't require analysis. He turned off the light and lay down, letting the quiet fill the room. And as he closed his eyes, there was no voice, no system, no signal, no message. Just a final thought, calm and steady, like something settling into place after a long journey. Not everything that is remembered is new. And not everything that returns was ever gone. And for the first time in a long time, Evan slept without feeling like anything was unfinished. Noah, 27, first noticed something strange on a completely normal evening while going through an old phone he had kept in a drawer for years. It wasn't his current phone, just an old backup device he never bothered to reset. He only powered it on because he was looking for old photos he thought might still be saved somewhere inside it. The phone booted slowly, lagging as it loaded years of unused data, and at first everything looked exactly like he remembered: old apps, forgotten contacts, and outdated messages. But then he noticed something unusual. There was a messaging app open that he didn't recognize installing, and inside it was a single conversation thread with no name attached, just a blank contact labeled. At first, Noah assumed it was a glitch or leftover data from an old sync, but when he opened it, the messages were recent. Not years old like everything else on the phone, but from the last few days. The strange part was that the messages were written in a way that made them feel like responses, like someone was actively talking to him through a device that hadn't been used in years. The first message simply said, "You finally turned it on again." Noah froze for a second, staring at the screen, trying to figure out if there was any possible explanation. He checked airplane mode, SIM status, everything. Nothing suggested the phone should even be receiving anything, and yet the conversation continued. Noah didn't reply at first. He just stared at the message, trying to find a logical explanation for how an inactive phone could receive anything at all. After a few minutes, another message appeared. "Don't worry, I've been waiting." That was enough to make him put the phone down for a moment. Not out of fear exactly, but confusion that didn't have a place to settle. He walked around his apartment, checking his actual phone, checking Wi-Fi, even resetting the old device's settings, but nothing explained it. When he returned, another message had appeared. "You always check things too late, that hasn't changed." The wording unsettled him more than anything else. It didn't feel random. It felt specific, like someone who knew him personally or at least knew patterns about him that weren't obvious to strangers. Noah finally typed a response asking who this was, but when he sent it, the message showed as delivered instantly, even though the device had no active connection. A few seconds later, the reply came through, "You already know, you just forgot." That line made him stop completely because it didn't feel like a joke or a scam anymore. It felt deliberate. Over the next hour, Noah kept the phone in his hand, watching the conversation continue without his input. Messages would appear at irregular intervals, sometimes minutes apart, sometimes seconds, always responding to thoughts he hadn't even typed. One message said, "You're wondering if this is real." Another said, "You're trying to prove it wrong instead of understanding it." It was like the conversation was tracking his reactions in real time without him saying anything. Eventually, he typed again, asking how any of this was possible. The response was simple: "It's not happening now, it already happened." That answer didn't clarify anything, it only deepened the confusion. Noah went through the phone again, checking timestamps, message metadata, anything that could indicate manipulation, but everything looked normal except for the impossible presence of the thread itself. The conversation continued. "You left this open before, you just don't remember closing it." That was the first moment Noah felt something closer to discomfort, not because of what was being said, but because it implied something about his own memory that he couldn't verify. Noah decided to test it. He typed a completely unrelated message, something random about the weather, just to see if it would respond appropriately or break the pattern. The reply came almost immediately: "You're avoiding the real question." He frowned and typed again, asking what the real question was. The response took slightly longer this time. "Why did you stop replying the first time?" That line made him pause longer than anything else so far, because now it wasn't just predicting him, it was referencing something he had no memory of doing. He scrolled up through the conversation again, noticing something he hadn't paid attention to before. The earliest messages in the thread weren't recent. They were dated years ago, but the timestamps didn't align with anything he could remember. According to the thread, this wasn't the first time he had opened it. In fact, it suggested he had been part of this conversation intermittently for a long time. Noah sat down slowly, realizing the situation wasn't about a strange message anymore. It was about missing time he couldn't account for. Noah kept staring at the thread, trying to force it into something logical, but the more he looked at it, the less it behaved like a normal conversation history. The timestamps didn't just show recent activity, they stretched back in uneven gaps, like someone had been speaking to him across long pauses of time. Some messages were days apart, others months, and a few seemed to come in clusters that didn't match any consistent pattern. One message stood out more than the rest: "You always come back to this when you feel alone." Noah stopped reading for a moment after that. It wasn't threatening or strange on its own, it was accurate in a way that made him uncomfortable, because he couldn't immediately deny it. He tried closing the app, restarting the phone, even leaving it untouched for a while, but every time he returned, the conversation was still active. The strange part was that it didn't feel like it was waiting for him. It felt like it continued regardless of his attention. When he finally opened it again, a new message appeared almost instantly. "You're trying to disconnect, you always do that too." Noah frowned and finally typed something longer, asking directly if this was someone he knew. The reply took longer this time. "Not just someone you stopped listening to." That response stayed in Noah's mind longer than he expected. He set the phone down and tried to go about his night normally, making dinner and putting on something in the background, but he kept glancing back at the device like it might change if he ignored it long enough. Eventually, curiosity pulled him back. The thread had updated again. "You used to write back faster." That line hit differently, not because it was creepy, but because it suggested familiarity he couldn't place, like someone remembering habits he didn't even realize he had. Noah began scrolling through older parts of the conversation, and the further back he went, the more personal it became. The messages started referencing small, specific details, places he used to go, routines he no longer followed, even phrases he apparently used frequently in the past. One message read: "You always said you didn't like unanswered things, that hasn't changed." He sat down on the couch slowly, realizing that if this was fabricated, it wasn't random. It was built around him in a way that felt structured, almost studied. At some point, Noah decided to test something more direct. He asked the thread to explain who it was. This time, the response wasn't immediate. There was a noticeable pause before the reply came in. "You named me something different before." Noah stared at the screen, trying to remember if he had ever named a contact like this, but nothing came to mind. He checked his old contacts list on the phone, scrolling through hundreds of outdated entries, but nothing matched. Still, the thread continued. "You stopped using the name after the last argument." That word "argument" changed the tone in his head slightly, not because it confirmed anything, but because it implied history, emotional history, something unresolved. Noah tried typing again, asking what argument it was referring to, but instead of answering, the thread responded with something simpler. "You remember more than you're admitting." That line didn't feel like accusation, it felt like patience. Noah didn't sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind kept circling back to the same idea, that this wasn't random data or corrupted software, but something tied to him personally. The next morning, the thread was still active. A new message appeared before he even touched the phone. "You usually check this early when you can't sleep." That detail made him pause again, because he had done exactly that without thinking about it. He finally asked the question he had been avoiding: if this was connected to his past, why couldn't he remember it clearly? The reply took longer than usual this time, because forgetting was easier than finishing it. Noah felt a quiet discomfort reading that, not fear, but something heavier, like unresolved familiarity. He tried to think back through his past relationships, friendships, anything that might connect, but everything felt fragmented. Nothing clearly matched the tone or intensity of the messages. Later that day, Noah went to work, but the phone stayed in his pocket the entire time. He kept feeling it vibrate occasionally, even when there were no notifications. When he finally checked it during lunch, there was a single message waiting: "You're pretending not to think about it." He exhaled slowly and didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just stared at it, realizing the conversation wasn't just reacting to messages, it was reacting to his behavior in real time. That evening, he decided to push back harder. He asked directly if this was some kind of experiment or prank. The reply came quickly: "You always look for external explanations first." Then, after a short pause: "That's why you stopped responding last time." Noah leaned back in his chair, realizing the conversation kept circling the same idea, that he had already engaged with this before and ended it for reasons he couldn't access anymore. By the 10th part of the thread, Noah started noticing something else. The emotional tone of the messages wasn't escalating, it was stabilizing. Instead of becoming more intense or aggressive, it was becoming more reflective. One message simply said, "You don't have to remember everything to understand it." Another followed later: "You left because remembering hurt more than not knowing." That statement made him stop for a long time, not because it felt supernatural, but because it suggested emotional history rather than mystery. For the first time, Noah didn't immediately try to disprove it. Instead, he just sat with it. The idea that something had happened in his life that he chose to disconnect from, not because it was fake, but because it was too real. The thread remained open, but no new messages appeared for several minutes. Then finally, one last line came through before the next silence: "When you're ready, you'll stop asking who I am and start remembering why you left." After the last message appeared, Noah didn't respond for a long time. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because everything in the conversation had shifted from being confusing to being uncomfortably personal. It wasn't just the idea that someone knew him, it was the way they knew him. The phrasing, the timing, the pauses between messages, it all felt structured around his behavior rather than reacting to it. He put the phone face down on the table and tried to focus on other things, but it didn't help. Even when he wasn't looking at it, he felt aware of it, like it was still part of the room in a way that didn't depend on light or sound. When he eventually picked it back up, another message was already waiting: "You're avoiding the part where this starts to make sense." Noah exhaled slowly and sat down properly this time, realizing he wasn't going to get anywhere by treating it like a glitch or coincidence anymore. He asked a different question: not "Who are you?" but "What is this conversation supposed to be?" The reply didn't come immediately. Instead, there was a delay long enough to feel intentional. Then finally: "This is the version of the conversation you didn't finish." That sentence didn't explain anything on the surface, but it changed the direction of everything in his head, because it didn't suggest randomness anymore, it suggested continuation. Noah started going through his old backup data more carefully after that. Photos, messages, contacts, anything that might connect to the thread. Most of it was normal at first: old friends, outdated conversations, forgotten group chats. But the longer he searched, the more he noticed gaps in his memory that he couldn't easily explain. Entire periods of time from a few years ago felt less detailed than they should have been. Not missing, just unclear, like trying to remember a conversation you had while half asleep. Eventually, he found something that made him stop. A partially synced message archive from years earlier, labeled with a contact name he didn't immediately recognize. But when he opened it, the tone of the messages felt familiar in a way that made his stomach tighten slightly. The phrasing matched the thread on the old phone almost exactly. Short, reflective messages, patterns of waiting, noticing, responding. And then he saw something that made him sit back slowly. The last message in that old archive was from him. It said, "I can't keep doing this in loops." There was no reply after it, just silence for months in the record. Noah stared at that line for a long time. "I can't keep doing this in loops." It didn't feel like something he would say without reason, but he also couldn't remember the context behind it. That was the part that bothered him most, not the message itself, but the lack of emotional connection to it. Like reading a sentence written in his own handwriting, but not remembering the thought behind it. When he returned to the old phone, the conversation thread had changed slightly, not in content, but in structure. Messages were now grouped more clearly, as if reorganized. The first new message simply said, "You found the break point." Noah asked what that meant. The response was immediate this time. "The last time you stopped, you did it at the exact same place." That made him pause because it implied repetition, not metaphorically, but literally. a repeated behavioral pattern he had gone through before. He asked again if this was some kind of psychological trick or system, but the reply didn't engage that question. Instead it said, "You always try to turn emotional patterns into technical problems." That line hit differently than the others, not because it was strange, but because it felt accurate in a way he couldn't immediately defend against. That night, Noah stopped trying to solve the conversation and instead just let it run in the background while he sat quietly in his apartment. He noticed something subtle after a while. The messages didn't appear randomly. They appeared during moments when he was thinking about specific things. If he thought about stopping the conversation, a message about hesitation would appear. If he thought about ignoring it, a message about avoidance would appear. It wasn't reading his mind. It felt more like it was responding to emotional direction rather than language. Eventually, one message came through that didn't feel like analysis or observation. It was softer. "You didn't leave because you stopped caring." Noah looked at it for a long time before anything else appeared. Then another message followed. "You left because it started to feel like it knew you better than you knew yourself." That one made him put the phone down again, not because it scared him, but because it described something he couldn't immediately dismiss. The idea that familiarity itself could become overwhelming enough to disconnect from. The next morning, Noah woke up and instinctively checked the phone before anything else. The thread was still there, but the tone had changed again. It was calmer now, less reactive, more steady. One message was waiting. "You're getting closer to remembering the pattern instead of the details." He sat on the edge of his bed, reading it slowly. At this point, the conversation didn't feel like it was trying to reveal something new anymore. It felt like it was guiding him toward understanding something he had already lived through but never fully processed. He asked one final question before leaving for work. "If this conversation is something I stopped before, why start it again now?" The reply came after a longer pause than usual. "Because you always return when life becomes quiet enough to hear it again." Noah didn't respond after that. He just sat there for a while, realizing something he hadn't considered before. The thread wasn't pulling him in. It was waiting for him to reach a point where he would willingly look back at it again. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he was uncovering something hidden, or remembering something he had already chosen to forget. By the time Noah reached this point in the conversation, something had changed in the way he interacted with it. He no longer immediately reacted to each message like it was an anomaly or a problem to solve. Instead, he started reading them more slowly, letting them sit for a moment before deciding what they meant to him personally. The phone itself had stopped feeling like a device behaving strangely and started feeling more like a space where something unresolved kept resurfacing when he allowed it to. That morning, the thread was already active again before he even touched the phone. A single message was waiting. "You're not looking for answers the same way anymore." Noah didn't respond right away. Instead, he just sat there, noticing how accurate that felt without him needing to confirm it. A few days ago, he would have been focused on proving whether this was real or fake. Now he was more focused on why it felt familiar, why none of it felt completely foreign anymore. When he finally replied, he didn't ask a question. He simply typed, "I don't understand why this feels like something I've already lived through." The response took longer than usual this time, almost as if the system, or whatever it was adjusting to his shift in tone. When the reply came, it didn't explain anything directly. It said, "Because you didn't finish processing it the first time, you only stopped engaging with it." Noah read that sentence several times. It wasn't claiming something supernatural. It wasn't even claiming something impossible. It was suggesting something much simpler and somehow more unsettling, that this wasn't new information, just unresolved experience. Noah spent most of that day distracted, not by urgency, but by reflection. The idea that something in his past had been left incomplete kept looping in his mind, not as a mystery, but as a feeling he couldn't fully attach to a specific memory. He started thinking about relationships he had in the past, not just romantic ones, but friendships too, people he had slowly drifted away from without major conflict or closure. That part felt familiar in a way he hadn't fully acknowledged before. Not abandonment, but quiet endings. Situations where nothing technically broke, but nothing fully continued either. When he checked the phone again later that afternoon, another message had appeared. "You've always been better at leaving things unresolved than confronting them directly." That line made him pause longer than the others. It didn't accuse him. It described a pattern, one that felt uncomfortably consistent with how he handled most emotional situations in his life. The thread continued shortly after. "That's why this conversation exists in fragments instead of a single moment." Noah leaned back slightly after reading that, realizing the conversation itself mirrored that idea, never fully starting, never fully ending, just continuing in spaced intervals over time. For the first time, he considered something different. Maybe the point wasn't to uncover a hidden truth, but to reconnect disconnected parts of something already known. That night, Noah decided to sit with the phone without trying to interrupt or analyze anything. He just kept it open on the table while he did other things around his apartment, cooking, cleaning, small routines that usually filled silence. Every so often, he would glance at the screen, half expecting a new message, but there were long stretches where nothing appeared at all. It almost felt like the conversation was respecting his pace now instead of pushing its own. Then, much later in the evening, a longer message arrived than any before it. It wasn't fragmented or reactive. It read like a continuous thought. You didn't stop because something ended. You stopped because continuing required you to stay emotionally present in a way you weren't ready for at the time. So you disconnected from it instead of resolving it. Noah read that slowly, not reacting immediately. For the first time, the message didn't feel like it was trying to convince him of anything. It felt like it was describing something without judgment. He typed back a single line, "Why does it feel like you're not a separate person?" The response took longer than usual. When it came, it was simple. "Because I'm not trying to become someone new to you. I'm trying to restore continuity with someone you already knew." That sentence stayed with him longer than any of the others so far. Over the next day, Noah noticed something subtle shift in how he thought about everything. The idea of the conversation being external or artificial became less important. What mattered more was the emotional pattern behind it. It wasn't about proving identity anymore. It was about recognizing consistency. The messages weren't introducing new ideas. They were revisiting unfinished emotional states in a structured way, almost like slowly walking back through something that had been left incomplete. He found himself remembering small things that hadn't come up in years. Not big dramatic memories, but subtle emotional impressions, feelings of long pauses in communication, conversations that ended without resolution, and people he had gradually stopped replying to over time. None of it formed a single clear story, but together it created a pattern that felt increasingly familiar. When he checked the phone that evening, the message was already there waiting. You're starting to recognize the shape of it instead of the details. Noah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he sat with that thought, because now instead of trying to figure out what the conversation was, he was starting to understand what it had always been doing, not revealing something hidden, but slowly reintroducing something incomplete. That night, Noah finally let the conversation sit without trying to extend it further. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look for confirmation. He just read the last few messages again and allowed them to exist without resistance. The phone stayed on the table beside him while the room grew quieter, the kind of quiet that makes thoughts feel more structured instead of scattered. Before going to bed, one final message appeared. It didn't feel like an explanation or continuation anymore. It felt like closure. It simply said, "You don't need to remember everything for it to stop feeling unfinished. You only needed to stop avoiding what you already understood." Noah didn't reply. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned off the screen and set the phone aside. For the first time since the thread appeared, he didn't feel like there was something waiting for him inside it. Not because everything had been solved, but because the need to keep searching had faded. And as he lay down that night, he realized something quietly simple. Some conversations don't end because they are solved. They end because they are finally understood enough to let go. And this time, he didn't feel like he had forgotten anything. He just felt like he had finally stopped running past it. Mason, 31, moved into a quiet apartment building on the edge of a small city after accepting a new job that required him to relocate quickly. The building itself wasn't impressive at first glance. It was older, slightly worn, but clean and well-maintained in a way that suggested steady care rather than neglect. The landlord had explained that most tenants stayed long-term, and turnover was low, which made the place unusually quiet compared to other apartments in the area. When Mason received the keys, he was given more than just a standard lease packet. Along with it was a small envelope labeled simply, "Resident Introduction." Inside wasn't a welcome letter in the usual sense, but a short note explaining that the building kept a tradition of leaving behind residential reflections from previous tenants. The landlord described it casually, almost like it was a form of community journaling. According to him, tenants occasionally wrote short notes about their experiences living there, and those notes were stored in a small archive room in the basement. Mason didn't think much of it at first. It sounded like a quirky building tradition rather than anything important. Still, something about it stuck in his mind as he carried his belongings upstairs to his new apartment. The hallway was quiet, with soft lighting and doors evenly spaced along both sides. Each door had a small brass number plate, slightly worn from age but polished enough to suggest regular upkeep. There were no loud neighbors, no background noise from TVs or music, just a kind of calm silence that felt intentional rather than empty. His apartment itself was simple. Living room, kitchen, bedroom, nothing unusual. Everything was functional and clean, like it had been prepared for him rather than left behind. What stood out most was the desk in the corner of the living room. It wasn't mentioned in the listing photos, and it didn't match the rest of the furniture in style. On the surface it looked normal, but it felt slightly older, like it belonged to someone else's routine. That evening, while unpacking, Mason noticed something he hadn't paid attention to earlier, a small drawer built into the desk that didn't open easily. It was slightly stuck, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. After a bit of effort, it finally opened, revealing a single folded piece of paper inside. No envelope, no label. Just a handwritten note. It read, "Welcome to 3B. You'll notice things here that don't feel important at first. That's normal." Mason paused for a moment, reading it twice. There was no signature. No date. Nothing that explained where it came from. He assumed it was left behind by a previous tenant and forgotten during cleaning, which made the most sense. Still, the wording felt oddly specific, like it was addressing whoever happened to find it rather than being directed at a known person. He folded the note back carefully and placed it on the desk. Then continued unpacking. But for the rest of the evening, something about the apartment didn't feel unusual or unsettling, just observant. Like the space itself had a history of paying attention to the people who lived inside it. Mason didn't think much more about the note after placing it on his desk. It wasn't unusual for old apartments to have leftover items from previous tenants, and he assumed it had simply been missed during cleaning. Still, the wording lingered in his mind in a subtle way, not enough to concern him, but enough to notice. That night, as he continued unpacking, he started becoming more aware of small details in the apartment that he hadn't initially paid attention to. The way the floorboards shifted slightly under certain steps, the faint difference in lighting between the living room and kitchen, and the fact that the apartment felt unusually settled for a space that had supposedly been vacant. Later that evening, Mason stepped out into the hallway to get a better sense of the building layout. The hallway was quiet, with soft lighting spaced evenly along the ceiling and a faint smell of polished wood and cleaning solution. As he walked slowly past the other doors, he noticed something he didn't expect. Several of the doors had small envelopes tucked into the frames, similar in style to the one he had found. Not all of them, but enough to make him pause. Each envelope looked slightly different in age, but they were all placed in nearly identical positions, as if following a pattern rather than coincidence. Mason didn't touch them, but the sight of them stayed with him as he returned to his apartment. The next morning, Mason decided to ask the landlord about the note and the envelopes. He found him in the small office near the building entrance, sitting behind a desk covered in neatly stacked papers and files. The landlord listened calmly as Mason described what he had found, nodding occasionally as if the explanation was already familiar. When Mason finished, the landlord leaned back slightly and explained that the building had a long-standing tradition of what he called resident reflections. According to him, tenants over the years had occasionally left behind written notes about their experiences living in the building, and instead of discarding them, the management kept them stored in a small archive in the basement. It wasn't mandatory, just something people chose to participate in. Mason found the explanation a bit unusual, but not impossible. Some older buildings had similar traditions, and the landlord didn't seem to be hiding anything. Still, what stood out was how casually he spoke about it, as if it was a normal part of the building's identity. Before Mason left the office, the landlord handed him a small key without much explanation and said it was for the archive room if he ever felt curious enough to look. Mason accepted it but didn't commit to anything. At the time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to get involved in something that already felt slightly unfamiliar. Over the next few days, Mason settled into his routine in the apartment. Work, unpacking, small adjustments to the space, it all felt normal enough, but the idea of the notes in the hallway kept resurfacing in his thoughts. Eventually, curiosity outweighed hesitation, and one evening he decided to take a closer look. He stepped into the hallway again and walked slowly along it, this time paying attention to each door more carefully. The envelopes were still there, unchanged, tucked into the same positions. What he hadn't noticed before, however, was that some of them had faint handwriting on the front, though not full names, just initials or short phrases. One in particular caught his attention. It simply read 3B before adjustment. Mason stared at it for a moment longer than the others. His apartment was 3B. He didn't understand what before adjustment meant, but the phrasing felt oddly specific. It didn't sound like something casual tenants would write. It sounded more like a label or classification. He didn't open the envelope, but he found himself thinking about it long after he returned to his apartment, wondering why something like that would be attached to a door rather than stored away. That night, Mason decided to use the key the landlord had given him. He wasn't fully committed to the idea of the archive room, but curiosity had grown too consistent to ignore. He went down to the basement, which was quieter than the rest of the building, with a cooler temperature and a faint echo in the air that made every step feel slightly longer. At the far end of the basement hallway, there was a simple door with no label, just a small keyhole in the center. The key fit perfectly. Inside, the room was not what Mason expected. It wasn't dusty or abandoned, but organized. Shelves lined the walls, each filled with neatly labeled folders. Some were older, slightly worn at the edges, while others looked more recent. Each folder had a code or apartment number written on it, along with what looked like dates spanning across years. Mason slowly walked along the shelves, noticing patterns in the labeling system. Every tenant seemed to have their own section. Some folders were thick, filled with multiple entries, while others were thin, almost empty. Eventually, he found a section labeled 3B, his section. He stood there for a moment before reaching for it, realizing that whatever this place was, it wasn't random storage. It was organized memory, not just of the building, but of the people who had lived in it. And for the first time, Mason started to wonder not just what the building kept, but why it needed to remember it all. Mason stood in front of the 3B section for a long moment before touching anything. The archive room wasn't unsettling, but it carried a kind of quiet seriousness that made every movement feel more intentional than usual. The folders weren't stacked randomly. They were arranged in a way that suggested order over time, as if someone had been maintaining a long-running record system rather than just storing old tenant belongings. He eventually pulled out the folder labeled 3B, noticing that it felt slightly heavier than expected. Inside, there weren't personal effects in the way he imagined there would be. Instead, there were neatly organized pages of handwritten notes, short summaries, and dated entries. The first page wasn't about him at all. It was a simple introduction sheet titled Occupant Observation Log. 3B below it were short, neutral statements describing general patterns of life in the unit. Things like when the apartment was usually quiet, when tenants typically settled in, and even small notes about how often people rearranged furniture or changed routines. It didn't feel invasive at first, it felt observational, almost like someone was tracking how a space was used rather than who used it. Still, the more Mason read, the more personal it started to feel in subtle ways. The entries weren't emotional, but they were specific. They described habits that weren't immediately obvious, like the tendency for tenants in 3B to sit near the window during certain hours, or how most residents kept the desk in the same corner of the living room regardless of layout changes. He paused when he realized the current layout of his apartment matched one of the earlier descriptions exactly. Mason spent longer in the archive room than he originally intended. The deeper he went into the folder, the more structured the records became. Instead of general observations, later pages included short timelines of tenant behavior changes. Not dramatic changes, just subtle shifts in routine over time. For example, one entry described a previous tenant gradually changing sleep patterns over several months, while another noted how a different occupant began using the same corner of the kitchen at the same time every evening. What stood out most was how consistent the tone remained. There was no judgment in the writing, no emotional framing, just structured documentation of how people interacted with the space over time. It felt less like surveillance and more like long-term environmental recording. Still, Mason couldn't ignore the fact that his own habits were being described with increasing accuracy as he read further into the folder. One page noted that new occupants of 3B typically begin noticing the archive room between the 3rd and 7th day of moving in. Mason checked the date of the first note he found in his apartment. It had been exactly 4 days. He closed the folder slowly, not because he felt uneasy, but because he realized he was being documented in real time in a system that already existed long before he arrived. The question wasn't whether it was happening. The question was how long it had been happening without anyone really paying attention. When Mason returned upstairs, the apartment felt slightly different, not in appearance but in awareness. He couldn't explain it clearly, but he found himself noticing details that had blended into the background before. The way sound carried differently in each room, how certain parts of the floor felt more naturally walked on than others, and even how the lighting shifted slightly depending on the time of day. It was as if the apartment wasn't changing, but his attention to it was. That evening, he found another small envelope slipped under his door. It hadn't been there earlier when he returned from the basement. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short note written in the same neat handwriting he had seen in the archive. It read, "You found the section faster than average. That usually means you're paying attention earlier than most." There was no signature again, only a small marking in the corner that looked like a simple code, 3B07. Mason sat with the note for a long time, not because it was alarming, but because it felt like confirmation of something he hadn't fully accepted yet. The building wasn't just storing information, it was actively continuing it. The idea that there was an average timeline for noticing something like this made it feel less like coincidence and more like process. The next morning, Mason decided to approach the landlord again. This time, he didn't mention everything he had found, only that he had gone down to the archive room and looked at some of the folders. The landlord reacted calmly, almost expectedly, as if this was a normal part of moving in. He explained that not every tenant looks at their records, but most eventually do. According to him, the archive wasn't meant to influence anyone, it was simply there so that patterns of living could be preserved over time. When Mason asked why the building kept something like that, the landlord paused for a moment before answering. He said the building had been around long enough to notice that people often forget small parts of their lives that feel unimportant in the moment, but later become meaningful in hindsight. The archive was meant to preserve those details, not for control, but for continuity. Mason wasn't fully satisfied with the answer, but there was no clear contradiction in it either. Before leaving, the landlord added something that stayed with him longer than expected. He said, "Most people think a place is just where they live, but some places remember how they lived." Mason didn't respond, but the phrase lingered in his thoughts the rest of the day. That night, Mason started noticing something more subtle than before. Not changes in the apartment itself, but in how familiar certain routines felt even though he hadn't established them yet. Sitting in specific spots without thinking about it, pausing near the window at the same time each evening, even placing objects down in consistent locations without consciously deciding where they should go. It wasn't forced, it felt natural. That was what made it harder to question. He found himself thinking about the archive again, wondering if the records weren't just documentation of past tenants, but something that extended into present behavior as well. Not in a controlling way, but in a reflective one, as if the space encouraged continuity by reinforcing patterns already forming. Later that night, another note appeared under his door. It was shorter this time. It simply read, "3B adjusts slowly. Most people don't notice until they already belong to it." Mason read it twice before placing it on the table. By the 10th day, Mason stopped treating the archive as something separate from his living experience. Instead, he started seeing it as an extension of the building itself. Not hidden, not secret, just present in a way most people didn't actively acknowledge. When he visited the basement again, the folders didn't feel like records of strangers anymore. They felt like layered versions of time, each one representing someone's ordinary life as it unfolded in that same space. He found himself wondering what his own folder would eventually look like, not in a fearful way, but in a reflective one. What patterns would be recorded, what habits would stand out over time, and more importantly, would he notice those patterns himself before they were written down by someone else? Before leaving the archive room, he noticed something new on the shelf where his folder sat. A small tag had been added beneath it that wasn't there before. It simply read, "Ongoing." And for the first time, Mason realized the building wasn't documenting him as an outsider. It was documenting him as part of its history. After seeing the "Ongoing" tag beneath his folder, Mason didn't rush out of the archive room like he expected he would. Instead, he stayed for a while longer, slowly walking between the shelves and noticing how structured everything felt. It wasn't chaotic or secretive. It was organized in a way that made it feel almost respectful, like the building wasn't trying to hide anything, it was simply preserving it. He began to notice something else too. The folders weren't just labeled by apartment number. Some had overlapping entries showing multiple tenants from the same unit over time, but with small notes connecting them. Things like shared routine similarity or behavioral continuity match. It wasn't saying people were the same, it was saying they tended to repeat patterns in the same space. Mason didn't fully understand what that meant yet, but it stayed in his mind as he left the basement. Over the next few days, Mason started paying more attention to his own habits, not out of paranoia but curiosity. He noticed how quickly routines formed without effort, where he set his keys every day, the chair he naturally gravitated toward in the evening. Even the way he positioned his laptop on the desk started becoming consistent without him planning it. One night, another envelope appeared under his door. This one felt slightly different. The paper was newer, cleaner. Inside was a short message: "You're settling into 3B faster than most." There was no signature, but the same small code was written at the bottom, 3B09. Mason didn't feel unsettled by it. Instead, he felt something closer to recognition. Like the building wasn't watching him in a hidden way, it was simply noticing what was already happening. Curiosity eventually led Mason back to the landlord again. This time he asked more direct questions, not about the archive itself, but about why people seem to leave notes at all. The landlord listened carefully before answering. He explained that over time, tenants began writing small reflections voluntarily, not because they were asked to, but because living in one place long enough naturally creates perspective. People notice patterns in hindsight that they don't always see while living them. He said the archive started as a simple storage idea, but over the years it became something more structured. A way to preserve how people experienced life in the building, not just what they did. According to him, it wasn't about surveillance or control, it was about continuity. Mason didn't fully agree or disagree, he just listened. Before Mason left, the landlord added something quietly. Most people think memories belong to them alone, but places collect them too, in their own way. That night, Mason sat by the window longer than usual. The building outside was quiet, with soft street lighting reflecting off the glass. He started thinking about how easily time passes without recognition. Days blend together, small routines form, then suddenly weeks have gone by without realizing anything changed. He realized the archive wasn't documenting anything dramatic. It was documenting that exact process, the way life slowly becomes familiar without being consciously noticed. That thought made him pause, not because it was strange, but because it felt accurate in a way he hadn't considered before. Later, another note appeared under his door. It read, "You're starting to notice what most people only realize after they leave." Mason kept this one on his desk instead of setting it aside. Mason returned to the basement again, but this time the archive felt less like a place of discovery and more like a reflection space. He went directly to his folder. It had grown slightly thicker since the last time he checked it. More pages had been added. One entry stood out. It described a stability phase beginning, where tenants begin to feel fully adjusted to the apartment and develop consistent routines without conscious effort. The note ended with a simple line: "This phase is associated with long-term comfort and reduced relocation tendency." Mason read that line a few times. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't dramatic, but it made sense in a quiet way. People often stay where things feel familiar, even if they don't fully notice how that familiarity formed. He closed the folder gently and left the basement, not because he was finished, but because he felt like he understood enough for now. Over the next several days, Mason's experience in the apartment became more stable, not in a strange or unnatural way, but in the way routines naturally settle. He found himself less focused on the archive and more present in daily life, cooking at the same time each evening, sitting in the same place to read, listening to the same quiet background sounds without changing them. The envelopes still came occasionally, but less frequently now. When they did, they were simpler, one-line messages like, "Consistency is forming," or "You're no longer observing as much, you're participating." Mason began to understand that the archive wasn't trying to separate him from his life. It was tracking how life naturally becomes structured when people stay somewhere long enough. One afternoon, Mason found a small new section added to the archive shelf labeled Shared Patterns. It contained notes comparing different tenants across different years, not personal details but lifestyle similarities. Things like morning routines, preferred room layouts, and even how people tended to decorate over time. What surprised Mason wasn't the data itself, it was the repetition. Different people, different years, but similar patterns forming in the same space. It wasn't saying people were identical. It was saying environments influence behavior more than people realize. He started seeing his own habits in a broader context now, not as individual choices, but as part of something larger and quieter. The next note Mason received didn't feel like a message anymore. It felt more like acknowledgement. It simply said, "You're understanding the building without needing explanation now." He read it once, then placed it on the table without much reaction. Something had shifted, but not in a dramatic way. It was subtle. His curiosity hadn't disappeared, but it had softened. Instead of asking, "What is this?" he was starting to ask, "How does this fit into everything else?" That change made the archive feel less like a mystery and more like a system of reflection. Mason visited the basement one final time, not out of curiosity, but out of habit. His folder was still there, still labeled ongoing, but now it felt less like a record and more like a living document, a summary of patterns still forming rather than something being observed from a distance. He realized something simple while standing there. Nothing about the archive was trying to define him. It was simply reflecting how he lived in that space over time, and that reflection, in turn, helped him notice things he might have otherwise missed. He didn't take anything new that day. He didn't need to. Weeks later, Mason sat in his apartment on a quiet evening, looking around at a space that no longer felt unfamiliar in any way. The routines he had developed weren't forced, they had formed naturally over time. The apartment didn't feel like something he moved into anymore. It felt like something he had adjusted to. He thought about the archive one last time, but without urgency, just understanding. Not everything in life needed to be recorded to matter. And not everything recorded needed to be questioned to be understood. When he finally received the last note, it didn't feel like an ending. It simply said, "You're not new to this place anymore. You've become part of its continuity." Mason placed the note on his desk, turned off the light, and let the quiet settle in naturally. And for the first time since moving in, he didn't feel like he was being observed. He just felt like he was exactly where he had settled to be.